to begin, I'll just give a brief outline, just give a bit of a roadmap of where we're going here. We're going to do a territory acknowledgement for where we are situated here on the West Coast, on unceded Coast Salish territory in and around Vancouver. And I will actually get Jewel to do that. Jewel, it's a little heads up if you want to unmute your mic in a second. But then we'll give a little bit more background on the specific place where we've done this work in the downtown East Side neighborhood of Vancouver. We'll talk a bit about some of the community perspectives on pitfalls and potential of research in this neighborhood. There's certainly a lot of research that's happened here. And we're going to talk more specifically then about one way that we as a group have tried to address some of the problems that all this research brings up. We've called this Research 101. We'll say more about that. We'll talk about this manifesto, this summary of community perspectives on ethical research that came out of Research 101. We'll talk about some of the, well, quite a bit of work that we've done since this was released about 1.5 years ago. And then we'll just open it up for wider questions. So Jewel, I wondered if you could unmute your sound again, and would you be able to do an acknowledgement of the land that we've been working on? Let's see if I can find Jewel. Jewel, are you there? Let me just see if I can get her to unmute her phone again.
Unmute. There we go.
There we go.
Okay. Can you hear me?
We can all hear you.
Sorry, technical difficulties. Okay, cool. We're here today on the unceded ancestral and occupied territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I'd like to thank you, everybody, for meeting with us and for getting to know everybody. Thank you. On my relations.
Thank you so much, Jewel. And there's many reasons that we acknowledge that history and that context of our work. It's something that's been asked of us by Indigenous communities on the West Coast here. It's a way of acknowledging the deep injustice of the theft of land and ongoing colonization that sort of the foundation of all of our work. And also, especially with the work that we do resisting and trying to think of community interventions to resist exploitative colonial research, we really raise our hands in acknowledgement of the long history of Indigenous communities doing that work amongst themselves, and really that we've learned so much from their work and carry that on in this specific community. Now I'm going to ask Simona, we're going to just give a little bit of a background to the Downtown East Side. Simona, if you would be so kind, we've got a little poem that we sometimes read that comes out of the neighborhood. Simona, would you be able to read the poem and maybe just say a few brief descriptions from your perspective of what this neighborhood that you've lived in for so long, what is it all about? Simona, are you there? You might be muted. Simona? There we go.
We need to tell our own stories. If we don't tell our stories, people with power will tell our stories for us. And we won't like what they have to say. We'll tell our stories when we reach out to others and build community. We share our plan, we share our home, we share our laughter. We share our determination when we tell our stories. We draw our own maps and questions. Sorry. Each of us has something to tell, something to teach. We speak the language of the heart here in the Downtown East Side, the soul of Vancouver.
Thanks, Simona. Did you mind just sharing maybe just a couple brief reflections on what is this neighborhood all about? How would you describe it to folks on literally the other side of the continent?
It's nothing like anywhere else. It's a community. It's like a great big huge family. Doesn't matter if you're one end to the other. Everyone treats you like you matter. If you use drugs or if you don't use drugs. It's awesome down here.
Thanks, Simona. And I think it's important to hear, you share that story in the way that you tell it, because I think so often the story of this neighborhood is really told by people who don't have your long experience of living there and being a part of that community. And I think that really gets to the heart of what this work is all about. As a little bit of a different sort of approach to telling the story of the neighborhood, you can see from this map, really the downtown east side is a very small part of Vancouver. It's just a few city blocks. It's kind of near the water and the ports there. But for a variety of reasons, it's of very great interest to many folks, researchers, documentary filmmakers, journalists, artists, all kinds of folks who don't live in the neighborhood really have an interest in telling the stories of this community. And that's for a number of reasons. The way that we've described this as a group is that there are many things researchers are interested in that happen in this community. And researchers tend to be interested in things like poverty, things like substance use, things like sex work, violence, mental health issues, various infectious diseases, etc. And so there's a lot of that going on in this neighborhood. There's a lot of housing instability. And that tends to be the main reason that researchers are drawn to the neighborhood especially. But those are not the only things going on in this community, as you heard from the way that Simona described her own perspective. But nevertheless, it is a heavily researched neighborhood. We've got a few numbers to kind of characterize this. This is sort of an older, outdated review by now, but this is a paper published in 2012, and they looked through all of the peer-reviewed articles, dissertations, and research reports that had been published in a 10-year period. They found pretty much 100 on just about this small neighborhood. But that's really just was, the kind of laughable in comparison to what it's been like more recently, which is sort of the next 8 years. This is a very recent review that was done. They actually found closer to 450 academic articles alone that had been published in that time frame, 2010 to 2018, all about the downtown east side. It was an average of about 50 articles published per year. That doesn't even include the 53 master's theses, 47 doctoral theses that are focused on this neighborhood. And the vast majority of those, about 60%, are still behind paywalls, so very inaccessible to folks in the community that don't have access through an institutional membership or library. So really it's a neighborhood that's kind of been covered in research in a sense. And of course, research can be helpful. Lots of the folks that we keep having conversations about research with don't deny there are lots of beneficial reasons to have researchers working in the community. In the context of the project itself, it can create some jobs, some meaningful employment for folks, even though it's temporary and small amounts. Especially when research is done well and in close collaboration with community interests and needs, can be sort of educational and empowering as a process to participate in. And a big one that people will point to is say that, especially when the research is really responding to the needs identified by the community, it can provide evidence for really important initiatives that are, in some cases, able to start because of research funding, in other cases, able to continue because of research funding. So many folks might be familiar with Insight, which is the first official government-sanctioned supervised consumption site in North America that was in Vancouver, and it really was able to start because of a research project and definitely able to continue to exist because of research that had demonstrated its efficacy in bringing all kinds of benefits to the neighborhood. There was many attempts to close it by government, but they were unable to because of the evidence that had been generated through research. Similarly, oh yeah?
It's not a consumption site, it's an injection site. You cannot smoke there.
You're very correct. Yes, that's a bit of an oversight on my part. So it's specifically, it's an injection site. It's true, there's no safer smoking facilities at that site, which it's pretty old now. So it's a little bit outdated compared to many of the things that have been happening with more lower barrier overdose prevention sites and consumption rooms in the neighborhood now. Thanks, Simona. The other one is Crosstown Clinic here, which is the first heroin-assisted treatment facility that was opened in North America. And that too has been really open because of a research project and able to be sustained because of ongoing research. So people recognize research can be helpful, especially if it's serving the needs of the community, serving the interests of the community. But of course, research can also be hurtful or harmful. There's many ways that this can happen. We talk about it sometimes in terms of triple X. So there can be research as a form of exploitation, research that maybe takes what it shouldn't. Think about research as a form of extraction, research that takes too much. Think about research as a form of exhaustion, research that really just ties up community members in pursuits that are maybe beneficial, but are just really taking a lot of their energy and focus that could have been spent on more directly relevant community work. A couple of other ones, false hope. It's very common for folks to talk about research in very idealistic, optimistic terms. We're working with this researcher because we're going to get this thing. And it sounds like researchers often convince people to partner with them because they've maybe drawn a overly optimistic straight line between their little research project and very concrete social changes in the lives of the folks they're working with, when, of course, as we hopefully all know, evidence-based policy is unfortunately a bit of a dream that isn't made reality all of the time. And yeah, there's not necessarily a direct line between research and action. Another one is just that research often is an excuse for not doing the thing that the community already knows needs to be done. We need more research as a really common deflecting sort of excuse, a way of delaying action. Also, much research can feel very irrelevant to the lived experience and the needs of community members themselves, especially maybe a little bit more theory-focused type of research that's less moving further away from the direct material needs and interests of community members. And then finally, I think this is a really important one that we don't always acknowledge often enough, which is that research itself can perpetuate stigma about a place. Sometimes people talk about place stigma or territorial stigma, and that's very much the case in a neighborhood like the Downtown East Side, especially when people that don't live there are often telling its story. This is one key example. I hope nobody's collaborators with these folks, but if you are, get in touch with me and we can talk more. But this is a really, a well-intentioned study from my own university, folks there working in public health, focused on the Downtown East Side neighborhood, and they didn't actually talk to a single individual in the neighborhood. This is an entirely administrative records linking type study. So they were connecting, justice data with health data and social services. And they were, published this paper kind of providing this description of a certain subset of residents in this community. Local media picks up the story and they say SFU study suggests 300 offenders on the Downtown East Side cost $26.5 million in services. Not exactly a great look for the neighborhood. And then of course, other folks, columnists, a little bit more maybe reactionary, pick this up and basically use this to continue to justify and move forward their narrative that the gentrification and displacement of this place basically can't come soon enough, according to them. And so even though the research itself isn't, directly malevolent, the researchers said, our goal here was to point out there's, cracks in the system. It's a revolving door. We got to improve things. Nevertheless, ended up being a very stigmatizing narrative that is used by other folks that have an interest in really removing or decreasing the role of this community in the city. And that brings us to, if you're not familiar with the work of Eve Tuck, she's an Indigenous education scholar. I believe she's now at University of Toronto. Highly recommend her work, especially this paper from 2009. She writes it as a community member, as an Indigenous person herself, to her fellow community members, communities in urban centers and Indigenous communities who get researched a lot. And she tries to raise this awareness around the problem with damage-focused research. And she invites people to consider, she says, join me in revisioning research in our communities, not only to recognize the need to document the effects of oppression on our communities, but also to consider the long-term repercussions of thinking of ourselves as broken. She says the time has come for our communities to refuse to be complicit in our further categorization as only damaged, as only broken. And what she's really talking to is sort of this thing, this example that we just gave, which is that so much research in this community has focused almost entirely on the, the outcomes of oppression, the disease, the poverty, the substance use, the risks, and less so on the positive things, on the resistance, the resilience, the community, the solidarity. So what is Research 101? Well, it comes into this space where there's so much research happening in this community and many shared experiences amongst folks living there, community organizations working there, with just, negative experiences with researchers, with research organizations, trying to tell their story on their behalf and maybe not doing it in the best way. And so we've acknowledged that research is unlikely to stop in the neighborhood, but is there a way to try and reduce some of the harms, or as Jennifer said at the beginning, make research less icky? Thanks for that great phrase. And so this is where we came to this idea called Research 101. The two kind of main goals here was to try and create some process where we could clarify, bring to the surface community expectations for respectful, useful, and ultimately ethical, by the standards of the community, ethical research in the Downtown East Side, and also to try and reduce the harms associated with research by empowering community members to say no or to demand more from researchers. And there's sort of two key organizations that really partnered from the very beginning with this project. One is my own university, Simon Fraser University's Van City Office of Community Engagement. This guy here, Joe Hall, was one of the first sort of funders and supporters of the project, gave us the money to get things going. And then also down here, we've got Sarah Common and her organization Hives for Humanity, which is a lot of amazing work in the community, a lot of it around bees and beekeeping and gardens, but also very much about how do we tell the story of this neighborhood. So they were the key community partner here. And together we developed this 6-week workshop series on research ethics in the Downtown East Side. And a key moment about sort of who ended up being in the room, and I'll maybe get Simona to jump in here, but I met Simona at a board meeting of the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users. And Simona, how did that go, or what happened next?
I just started talking to people that I know, which is only a couple of them. And I don't know, started mushrooming from there.
Would you say you hooked me up?
Yeah.
So Simona, I was very fortunate to meet Simona. I was a very well-connected individual in the neighborhood. And she was able to connect me to a lot of, just important folks that, like her, have a lot of experience with research and researchers in the neighborhood. So that was a really key connection for me. And I'm glad Simona's been able to stick around as a really close collaborator and friend throughout this last 2.5 years. So you could see all of the different organizations that ended up, sending 1 or 2 representatives from their groups. And these are organizations, key organizations in the community. By no means all of the organizations in the community. There's a lot of amazing groups doing great work in the neighborhood. But these are the ones that we worked with. They're, broadly representing folks who are involved in sex work, people who use drugs, Indigenous folks in the neighborhood, and just other, community centers, etc. So just some really key organizations that do a lot of work with researchers already, so have a lot of relevant experience and expertise to share to this process. So we engaged with all these different folks. Each week there was about 6 to 13 folks that would show up, and the majority of these are, there's different perspectives on the terminology, but most of the folks might identify as peers or people with lived experience of substance use, sex work, criminalization, over-research, etc. So that's who was in the room. And I mentioned these 6 weeks. The first 5 weeks, we were just in a room and kind of talking about this background, introduction to research in the Downtown East Side. What have people's experiences been? What have been the, the pitfalls and the potential? The second week, we moved into a little more specific questions, thinking about the early stages of a community partnership. And what is it that community folks or organizations really want to ask researchers to just establish the kind of relationship or partnership that's going to benefit them? The third week, we got into talking about ethical review, some of the differences between institutional, university-based REB review versus community perspectives on ethics. The fourth week, we started talking more about the actual practice of collaborative research, and especially issues around power and peer collaboration. And then the fifth week, we talked more about more of these later stages of research, where we're talking about, so what does it actually bring back to the community? What does reciprocity look like in this context, where researchers are clearly benefiting from the work? How is the community benefiting from the work? Simona's laughing because both her and Jewel thought I made the word reciprocity up when I first told them about it. But in fact, they understood the concept very well, I think. In the sixth week, what happened is we had been recording notes on everybody's discussions and perspectives being shared throughout those first 5 weeks. And we came back with a sort of very rough draft of this manifesto. You'll see Nick here on the left, who unfortunately doesn't look like he's been able to join us today, but he's been a key collaborator throughout as well. But he suggested we should write a manifesto for ethical research in the Downtown East Side. And so that's what we did. And so here you can see we've all got a paper copy. We're reading through it line by line, deciding, is this what we've been talking about? Are these our words? How do we edit it and make it, just so that this really feels like a reflection of the process we've been through? We got Simona there, we've got Jewel. Over here is Jim, who's been another key collaborator throughout the process as well. And there's this silly guy. And so ultimately what we came out of this final week with was this a little bit more polished draft version of this manifesto. And we decided that we would make everybody who had been a participant in at least one of the workshops a co-author on the manifesto. Just means there's a lot of co-authors. And we also decided we weren't going to try and determine who had contributed the most or whose words were showing up, the majority of the time. We just would make every participant, every contributor, person who'd shared their lived experience, shared their expertise, be a co-author, and we would just put those alphabetically. And then ultimately, the first place that we released this manifesto is where it still exists in its most up-to-date format. It's just online as a simple Google Doc that's really shareable. It's really accessible to everybody. You can still find it at this shortened address up here. But later, we were really fortunate to get some funds and some collaborators who helped to put it into a sort of snazzier looking version that's actually available as a hard copy booklet. That's been really great to be able to share that around the neighborhood. And if you go to that little that URL, you can find a link to a PDF version of this one as well. And then the other thing, this is sort of related to this project, it's not quite the manifesto, but it's connected, was a smaller card. And I'll actually, I do have a hard copy with me, but I'll just keep the screen share going. And this little foldable card is meant to just fit in someone's pocket or wallet and provides a series of questions that you could really bring to any proposed partnership between yourself as a community member and someone else who's trying to tell your story or tell your community story. Lots of really helpful things that you can think through. So what we'll do now before we sort of talk about some of the next steps and then just wind up with some time for questions is I'll just quickly go through some of the key highlights of this manifesto. I'm going to get Jewel and Simona to share a bit more in a couple of these specific spots. But kind of mirroring the process that we went through in those middle 4 weeks, there's a section in the manifesto for each one, kind of different stages of a typical linear community-based research project. We'll just go through those one by one here. So first of all, in this first stage of sort of, how do we start? How do we enter a community? How do researchers build relationships? And what are the things that community members in this context wanted to know about researchers? And so there's a whole variety of key questions that folks had for researchers when they're coming into a community, when they're saying, would you partner with me to do this research project? So people were really interested in knowing, okay, as a researcher, where are you coming from? What's your identity? Why are you doing this work? What's your motivation? What experiences have you had that have shaped your own perspectives on this issue? How are they going to influence even the research questions that you have? How much time do you have? Do you have enough time to collaborate with us in the robust way that we're expecting, that for us, to be able to feel like you're really respecting our process? And Jewel, I actually was wondering if you wanted to share a little bit. One of the things that I know you talked a lot about in Research 101 was the importance of researchers taking a trauma-informed approach to research, and especially developing interview questions. Jewel, would you be able to unmute? I wondered if you could say a little bit about some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's very important. People that are researched, everybody is a survivor of something in their lives. And I think going through trauma, being a person who's got trauma in their background, questions can be very sensitive to and trigger emotions or certain feelings from trauma. So it's really important that if there are questions like on that nature, to have some sort of resources, something that you can be able to have somebody be able to talk to somebody afterwards, to be able to connect them with some kind of resources if they're going to be triggered from traumatic experiences or traumatic memories, and also like designing questions like when they're actually making the questions for interviews and research, to sort of keep that in mind, that people are going to have different experiences and different traumas in their past, and to sort of be very sensitive to that and not push them if they're not willing to answer certain questions, then leave it at that. Don't force them to, or don't push them too far to make them feel like they have to answer, because that could actually do more damage than good. So just being aware that everybody's had some kind of experience or something in their background that can be triggering and can be triggered very easily. And if you're not experienced, or if you don't have the resources to back up to help those people, then really you're doing more harm than good, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing that, Joel.
Thank you.
And I know something else that you shared before, of just how sometimes researchers really aren't sensitive to that and don't necessarily notice even when community members are expressing that discomfort and are saying, you know what, maybe you keep asking me to share this, and maybe I will, but I don't actually want to. And wishing that researchers would be more sensitive to that and notice that and respect that. Another aspect here is just, I think that's something that came across really clearly from folks talking about their expectations, their hopes for how researchers would act and would start a research project in their community, is to really focus on what are the tangible actions that you're prepared to take on the basis of your research. Very few folks that I've come across in community settings interested in working with researchers have been interested in non-action oriented research. Very few folks are interested in doing research purely for the advancement of science or something, especially in contexts where there's a lot of important issues facing people that they really have questions about, and answers that will really determine the fortunes of them, their friends, and their community. Just one other idea in this section that I think is really interesting is the idea of a researcher reference letter. So if somebody is coming into the community and saying, hey, we want to work with you, and maybe they've done lots of collaborative work in the past in other communities, it might make sense for community members to say, well, can we hear from some of your past community collaborators? It'd be good to meet them and hear a bit about what your process is like. If a researcher has a trail of burnt bridges behind them, few communities would like to be the next victim, I think. So that's sort of one strategy that folks could use. This next section is really based in a sort of critique that we learned of from Yves Tuck and Monique Guichard, amongst others, who have published and written about a lot of the assumptions that typical institutional review boards, or research ethics boards as we call them up in the north here in Canada, a lot of assumptions that those folks doing that ethical review bring with them when they're reviewing projects. Often people are doing that as volunteers, as faculty members. with minimal training and sort of their own experience and knowledge of research and ethics, and very much are bringing with them their own assumptions about risk, about what constitutes harm, about what benefit looks like in contexts and in people's lives that they really know very little about. So those are some of the key ways that we can talk about that a little bit more, what that's looked like when we've done our own ethics reviews from a community perspective. But those can be really important ways that research ethics reviews at a university comes up with very different understandings of what's ethical compared to community understandings. Another shortfall of those boards is that they don't have an accountability mechanism. If you, as a researcher, say, this is what we plan to do, and that gets approved by ethics, nobody is going to ever check that you actually did that unless something really drastically horrible goes wrong and maybe a research participant literally calls up your ethics office and says, this is what happened. But it's very infrequent that that does happen. The other big shortfall is that often research ethics review is very much focused on individuals and not necessarily at communities. So in the case of the research we talked about that maybe was stigmatizing to the downtown east side, they didn't even have to talk to any individuals. And so they did do an ethical review, but they determined that that was going to be totally fine. No individuals are even going to be contacted. But what about that community level story that the research was ultimately going to be telling? What were the ethical considerations around that collective or group level object of the research? So two responses that people thought up or shared through Research 101 that are in the manifesto was, one, sit with us and go through your research ethics application with us. We'd like to see what you told the university you were going to do to consider the ethics and care of our community. Other ways of strengthening that agreement is to literally sit down and say, let's form a more formal kind of research agreement. Let's say, these are our responsibilities and these are your responsibilities as a researcher. This is what the terms of our agreement, how we're consenting to work together. And that can be a way of increasing the accountability that researchers have to their plan for ethics review. The final one, and we'll talk about this more, has really been a focus of a lot of our work in the last year, which is dreaming up what would at the time we called it a community research ethics board, but what would a community level process for reviewing ethics in proposed research applications, what would that look like? And we'll talk more about some of the work that we've done to move towards that in a bit. All right, so in the context of actual research, often community-based research involves community members in the research process, which is great, but also brings in really important new challenges that need to be acknowledged and recognized. And I think I'll probably ask Simona a little bit here, if you have some experiences of, what have some of these experiences been like? You can share, whatever you feel comfortable, but I know you've had some positive and negative experiences with research.
More than positive than negative.
That's good.
Yeah. Someone's like, I would do the work and then he'd be like, oh, we don't have any money to pay you to finish it. But we still do.
That sounds negative.
That was the only negative one.
Okay.
There's some good ones, like, we had to travel to talk to people and show them, I don't know, I'm so lost.
I think you've told me a bit about, just sometimes what has been your role as a peer research assistant? Like, what are some of the things that you've been doing?
What I've been doing. I've done data analysis. Is that what you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, like what other jobs that you've been given as a researcher?
I used to interview the people for the questions that they ask. And it's funny because when Andrew would ask him, they'd give him one answer. And then I'd take him aside and I'd ask him the same question.
Oops, I lost your sound there. You still there, Simona? Now
Yeah,
you're
so
muted. Now, there you are.
ethical substances navigating, I'm sorry. So then I'd ask him the same question and I'd get a totally different answer. And he'd be like, well, how come they didn't tell me that? I'm like, well, because you're one of them people. One of us, right? Which is true. I mean, we get a deeper truth than somebody with an academic scholar would get.
Absolutely. And I think that really underscores the incredible value that, that part of the incredible value that you have as a collaborator is, that researchers are really often depending on community members for their expertise and their experience, and the fact that they are a part of the community. And I think some of what folks were sharing in the Research 101 process was that that isn't always recognized as it should be, the value of that role that you can play. And so people talked about experiencing maybe a kind of like elitism sometimes from some academics who, maybe feel like they're better than you, you're just a peer, you're just a community member, and not recognizing that really, what you were relying on me to do this work well, to get, as you said, real answers from folks, to get to somewhere closer to the truth, which is really what hopefully researchers are interested in. And I think sometimes people recognize that they wish that they could be a little bit more centrally involved in actually steering the research, and less, sometimes people feel like maybe they're only being asked to collect the data or to, use their social networks within the community. Maybe they're just given these sort of, simple tasks or feel a bit tokenized. And they want to feel more like real collaborators that are on par with the academics and have very different expertise and knowledge, but not less valuable expertise and knowledge. I like this quote from the Manifesto, which is that research has been costly for our community. Very rarely has it actually benefited us. Don't assume your research is helpful, wanted, needed, or going to be beneficial for our community. We don't owe you anything. Then, of course, this last point, I think this is probably Simona's quote, where people really acknowledge you need to pay folks fairly for their time, whether that's research collaborators from the community or participants. And that needs to be in cash and not gift cards. Simona, do you want to read your own quote from the Manifesto?
And don't read us the story that we wrote the book about.
Oh, that's a great quote too. Don't read us the book that we wrote. I guess I meant the one on the screen. We don't ask what you do.
Oh, yeah. We don't ask what you do with your money. So don't worry about what we do with ours.
I think that really gets to the heart of a lot of the patronizing sort of, elitism that researchers often express, maybe subtly, towards community members of, well, maybe we should give them, gift cards. They might go, buy drugs with the money that we give them. So that kind of thing.
Cards, we're going to buy drugs.
That's a good point. It's just a few more steps away. So anyways, that was pretty important to folks to not feel that sense of just, of kind of belittlement from community members, from researchers. Okay, the last section here, in these later stages of a research partnership, folks really wanted to, at a bare minimum, hear what the research found. And people had stories where they said, what, I was part of this research project and we never heard back from that researcher. We never heard of them again. And that felt really hard for folks. People said that was devastating. And it felt like that's a common experience. I've also heard stories in the community where organizations said, what, we partnered with these researchers and they did come back and share it, but they basically made us do everything to make that possible. We had to, find a space for them to do their presentation. We had to invite everyone. We had to find a way to get food there and honoraria for folks. We had to get them a slide projector and a screen, and the researchers just sort of waltz in with their, USB stick and a PowerPoint, and they felt like that was their due diligence of, knowledge translation or something. And folks really felt like that is not enough, and that's not acceptable. That researchers need to plan for that, they need to budget for it, They need to coordinate meaningful knowledge translation, community feedback that should not fall to the community. And then the last piece, which I think is the more important one, is just that even if you come back and tell us what you found, that's not enough. That's not reciprocity. Researchers are getting degrees and academic publications and jobs and grants out of their research. What are they providing to the community? More knowledge or something interesting that we learned isn't quite on the same level as a job, a grant, a scholarship, etc. And so people really wanted researchers to think hard and to think creatively about what is meaningful, reciprocity in this context. How can the benefits to the community maybe come closer to equaling what the benefits are to the researchers? So people talked about, become our partners, not only in research, but in advocacy, in taking action on the basis of what we found together. Do that work of prioritizing those things first and saying the thing that we need to do first is get this information out to the community, get this to policymakers, take on that advocacy role, to write things together, to present together at conferences. People thought it was important that researchers translate their work out of this sort of hoity-toity academic language into plain words that most people can understand, that being a bare minimum requirement. And also people said, even beyond stuff related to your role as a researcher, think about how else you can show your gratitude and build reciprocity in the community. Just show up, volunteer, organize an event, provide material support to the organizations that have helped you. Lots of creative ways to think about this question of reciprocity. Just to wrap up, a few of the next steps that we've been doing. A big one that we had a sort of a bigger push in the first year after we released the manifesto was that we were trying to get organizational and individual endorsements of this manifesto. And the goal there was really twofold. First of all, is just to share within the community. This is something that we've done, and we know we didn't include every single person in this community, but we've got a feeling a lot of people would be on board with it. So we were trying to get confirmation of that by getting different organizations from the Downton East side to endorse it, to sign on to the manifesto, and also different individuals. And then the accountability piece is more for beyond the Downton East side, for research organizations, for universities, for local ethics boards. We wanted to share these resources and this process with them too, and also ask them if they would consider endorsing it, saying, you know what, we aspire to do these things too, and we want to learn, we want to get better at doing this work better in more respectful ways in this community. So we really spent a lot of time sharing it around. I mentioned the hard copy booklets, which have been really handy to have to share. This is Nick and I. He wasn't able to join the call today, but talking at Vandu about the manifesto. We had a really amazing panel presentation we did where we were kind of launching the hard copy version of the manifesto. There's Simona laughing it up. Yeah, so there's been a lot of just important ways that we've shared it at our universities and our communities. And then the next piece, which has been really exciting, is how we've tried to integrate this manifesto with local research ethics boards, or IRBs. And that's been really made possible through an incredibly supportive partnership we've had with an organization from UBC, which is their learning exchange. They do a lot of education in the Downtown East Side, but also try and support community-based research to work in more respectful ways. They've been great partners for this work, and they've helped to connect us to the folks that sit on these research ethics boards at SFU, at UBC, at a local health authority, and try and think together of how can we partner together and find ways of reducing some of the harms that are approved by your ethics boards and come into this community in the form of research. And then finally, this is the biggest piece we've been working on, and this is towards developing what we initially called a community-based research, a community research ethics board, or what we've now called the Community Research Ethics Workshop, or CREW. We call it that. We recognize we're not necessarily an REB. We want to be a place where we're thinking about research ethics together from a community perspective. And so we've been piloting reviews of research proposals over the last year. We've done 3 to date. Our most recent one, our finest work yet. And as part of this process, we've also been trying to learn a lot and sort of update. We're planning a revised version of this manifesto to hopefully happen this fall. This is us doing some of that more recent work in a time before everything was on computers. If you come across this, this is a paper that all of us wrote together in Harm Reduction Journal that came out in 2019, just describing more of the wider process that we did to develop the manifesto. I invite you to check that out. And one of the key takeaways we hope that comes through that paper is just that Research 101 is a process that we did that you could do in your community too. So the key steps would be, we call this Research 102 or 103. The key steps would be doing this first step of just figuring out who are the key stakeholders here, who are the groups or the individuals that are collaborating at the community level with researchers all the time. You know, what have those experiences been? Try and get those folks together and share stories, share resources. How have you been responding? You know, what's been going well? What could be going better? We found that writing those discussions down, summarizing them in some way, we called it a manifesto. You could call it something else, but that was a really important piece of making that a really community-based expression of these are our expectations. This is how you can, you know, not shoot yourself in the foot when you come and want to do work with us. Here's some, you know, starter tips for how you can do a better job of doing your work in the community. And then finally, doing everything you can to try and share those resources around has really, for us, created a really big conversation in the community. And as we are sort of witnessing here today, all the way in Rhode Island and beyond, kind of around the continent. So really, really grateful to have had the chance to share with you. Thank you so much for listening. And I hope we can have lots of good questions now. So many people have supported this work. I can't really name them all, but there's so many folks. And yeah, now we got some time for questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much. This was so delightful. I'm really grateful for everyone for taking the time to speak with us, to teach us, to share your knowledge with us. I know that it is a lot of work to sit in front of a camera and be visible, but all these people and talk for all this time. So thank you so much for giving us this privilege. I want to mention two quick things before we dive into questions. One is I want to make another plug for the book that was included in slide 1 of the show, which is Linda Tuiwai Smith's Decolonizing Methodologies. There's a bunch of people who are on this call who are really talented researchers in training, postdoctoral scholars, PhD students. This is the book that your advisors are not going to assign you, but should be. So I know that Linda Tuiwai-Smith, she is a professor of Indigenous education in New Zealand. She's also a Maori woman. She's an incredible, incredible mind. And I know the new Marlon James book is really good. So finish that first and then pick this one up next. It's awesome. Two, I want to open up the Q&A session by presenting a challenge, especially to individuals who occupy social positions like myself, where we are majority white, cisgendered, middle and above class individuals who have, you know, the privilege of university education or degrees after our name, and we adopt that researcher role in a lot of these relationships that we try to build, even in good faith. There is a thing that I tell my students all the time, that anything you say isn't data. And another way to put that is, if you've done all the talking, then you haven't done any learning while you were there. And I would like to challenge us all to recognize the moments where we're filling in meaning with stuff that we already brought in with us to the webinar without taking an opportunity to recognize that we haven't learned from someone else. When I read through the Research 101 manifesto earlier today, one of the phrases I came across that stood out to me, because I'm teaching the consent unit right now, was ongoing consent. And I was like, yes, ongoing consent. In my mind, I was like, yeah, that thing, totally got it. And only about an hour later was I like, no, I just took what I believe ongoing consent is and plugged it in and then assumed I'd learned something without actually listening to the person writing to me in the document about what it means. So with that, I would like to start right there with a terminology question and maybe try to dislodge some of our privileged knowledge here. So we had a really great question about the terms translating knowledge and knowledge accessibility, and that perhaps these are sort of accidental jargon that we've used. And can we unpack what that means? And I would especially love to know what community members who are speaking back to research have to say, like what is accessible knowledge or translated knowledge even, like what does that even look like?
Simona or Jewel, do you want to say anything about all the times you tell me to explain some dumb term I've used?
I think just keeping a lot of it in layman forms, so people can understand. It's nothing worse than feeling like you're just not up to the same level as somebody. When you hear a bunch of fancy words or words that you can't really use in everyday life, it's just, yeah. So I think it's huge. It's definitely important. And for like the answers as well, for like translating the answers that people give as well.
Simona?
I don't know. I hate it when they use big words. Sorry. It always bums in my face.
Yeah. And I think something I've tried to, I'm by no means very good at this, but I feel like I've been asked to explain often enough that I do try my best to not do that. But I think recognizing that there's probably a certain level of trust that you might need to build with folks before they even feel comfortable asking you to explain. So I appreciate when people do ask me to explain, say, hey, that did you make that word up? That word doesn't mean anything to me. So I recognize that is sort of a place that we've got to, I think, in our working relationship and friendship that I'm really grateful for. But yeah, to recognize that isn't necessarily a given, that people will just let you know when you're talking like an academic. So it's really on us to not necessarily assume either that we need to only use 5-letter words or something. There's sort of other arguments that I've heard of saying, well, lots of folks are coming from all kinds of places. You've got to check. You've got to ask people what they're comfortable with in the community and maybe just figure that out by trial and error, or put mechanisms in place to ask people to say, hey, if I say something, that's my fault, not yours. And please let me know when I'm the dumb one that's saying words most people don't understand. That's on me. So I think being intentional and upfront about that probably helps. I think the actual question was maybe slightly more specific than that.
I think so the individual who posed the question asked if there were resources about the concept of translating knowledge and about knowledge accessibility. I believe, if I'm reading the question correctly, it's about not only getting a better handle on what those terms mean, but how to go about doing the things embodied in those terms in a way that's responsible.
Yeah, there definitely is. There's a whole field of research and advocacy on plain language, for example. And actually, if one advantage of the Google Doc version of Research 101, the manifesto, is that there's a whole bunch of hyperlinks in the document. And that's sort of our way of referencing or citing or beckoning to the work of others. So if you go through that document, the section that's talking about knowledge translation, I think there might be a couple of links there where you could sort of learn a bit more, or just pass on, connect you to some more resources there, but it's a huge area for sure.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to actually combine the most recent 2 questions that have been posted because I think they relate. So the individual who posed the first question says they're also thinking about like writing things and making sure that products are accessible. And Michelle asked, what different formats was the manifesto shared in on the downtown east side? You've showed us a Google Doc and you've showed us this really beautifully laid out, like very talented graphic artists working on that, right? And so was there anything in between? How did you go about circulating this and like solving the problem of literally translating knowledge to be like, your community, hopefully you also have produced this, here's what it is in that community?
Yeah, I think the other big one would just be lots of like in-person talking to folks about it. So that, yeah, that has been a major piece of work. Me and Jewel or Simona or Jim or Nick, or sometimes combinations of us, have gone around and kind of done these little presentations to folks and explained a bit about the process that we did and answered questions and shared the resources that we have. I also think the card has been really handy, that smaller, more compact version. Somebody had a question about this, which is that it seems to be a bit more broadly focused, which is true. Research 101 is more specifically about research, although it can be applied and has been applied to fields outside of research. But the card is more specifically meant for anything that we call cultural production. So research, documentary filmmaking, artists, journalism, anytime someone's coming in and trying to tell a story about, you know, the neighborhood or individuals' lives that, you know, they don't share that experience or that identity. So those are a couple of the key ways. Yeah. We have had somebody say, well, have you thought about putting the manifesto into plain language? Which we tried our best, I guess, but probably we could do a better job of that. So that's something to remember, keep in mind as we move towards thinking of maybe an updated version or alternative versions.
I understand that. I've definitely produced short documents, and when it comes out, people are like, "Great, are you going to make a short version?" And I'm like, "Oh man, yeah." So okay, so there's someone asked a question that I actually want to append one of mine onto, sort of exploit my privilege here as moderator. But the question is, if you've reached out to journalists of any kind to provide this kind of guidance, and then I'm also curious a little bit about sort of what relationships the Downtown East Side has with the media in general, and if that's come into play at all in thinking through the problems or developing answers in the forms of the manifesto or otherwise.
Yeah, they're very, very connected. I'll pass it over to Simona in a second. I know you have some stories about media, but one thing that I clearly remember when going through research is I would ask people, okay, well, tell me some of your experience with the research. And often, maybe even half the time, people's stories about research were actually stories about interactions with journalists or TV crews. It all feels the same to people. You're someone I don't know asking me for my story to represent my community. So that line is less, it's more blurry for people than it is for me, who I'm like, oh, but was it research? Anyway, Simona, did you want to share any stories that you've had, or Jewel too? Feel free to jump in. Sorry, I meant with journalists, not research.
You can drag us too, it's okay.
You want to go, Jules?
I was just going to say that I think a lot of people are very cautious to. Ow! Sorry, that was my cat giving me a nice hook, little bugger. Sorry. I think they're very cautious. That was very brutal. To talk to journalists, because usually they have an agenda, and a lot of it, like I'm learning from experience, they get to know what their agenda is or what their mission is, because it's not always the same as yours, or the message isn't always going to be the same as what you're trying to get across. So it's kind of really important to make sure you're communicating and making sure that you're sort of on the same page and the same message or same information is going to get out, because a lot of the time you just assume that it's going to be that way, and then it turns out not, and it's kind of disappointing, to say the least. Yeah.
Jewel, are you referring, I know there was an example of this about a year ago. You were quoted or profiled in an article by CBC. Is that sort of what you're thinking of?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Like, I thought it was going to be a positive, like, you know, tell us about the Downtown East Side. And I know there was some negative with it, but for everything negative, I would say something positive to sort of counterbalance all the negativity. But they left all that stuff out. They just put in the negative stuff, and then they kind of left all the good stuff that I had to say out, which was kind of really annoying. So it just made it sound like, oh, the Downtown East Side, bad. So, yeah, there's nothing positive to sort of counterbalance that, which was kind of irritating, yeah. So they didn't mention anything of the good things that are going on and how we're trying to counterbalance the stigma and whatnot. So, yeah.
Yeah,
that's kind of chalk it up to a lesson learned for sure.
Yeah. Simona, I feel like you have a similar story where journalists or a TV crew had, they had a story they wanted to tell with you in mind, and you weren't exactly fitting what they'd expected. Does that ring a bell, or am I thinking?
Tell me a bit more, which one? No.
Well, Maybe it was Nick, actually. Maybe it's his story. But there was one story you tell about walking down the road with a journalist, and she was really amazed that you knew so many people.
Mm.
Oh, yeah. I do know a lot of people. That's because I do what I do, right? Like, I remember, well, Tracy, for example, when they first started taping her and getting her story, we called her the Bannock Lady here. And they used to make it sound like she was just like another drug addict, right? Until she passed away. And then it was like, we had her memorial and everyone was like, whoa, you know, like she was more than just somebody who pushed a shopping cart down the road with Bannock, right?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of experiences that people have had that are very similar, and perhaps even worse than research because it's a little bit less regulated. At least with research, you have had to go through some kind of ethical review process, whereas journalists have a different ethics code, and one that, unfortunately, something I think we've found is that journalistic ethics developed in a particular context, which is to hold powerful people to account. Which means, for example, if they quote you, you're sort of on record and they've got you and you don't get a chance to edit that or revise that or ask them to change it because they're here to report the truth, right? And we've had lots of discussions with journalists and folks that are familiar with this work in Vancouver who've said, that's not what those ethics are for in this context of the Downtown East Side. And so that's something that we've asked journalists to consider, and we have actually done a fair amount of work connecting with journalists and folks at UBC. I posted 2 local articles that have been written by journalists who came across the manifesto, and they were specifically sort of applying it to the world of journalism and maybe a bit more broadly as well. I really encourage folks to take them out. They're really excellent articles. The second one is a bit more specifically about the manifesto. Yeah, but I think we encourage people to think about, you know, somebody that you've met on the street in the Downtown East Side and you're asking them for their story. Like, that's a person who is not in the same social position as a politician that you're trying to catch on the record making promises they can't keep or something like that. So you can show them a different type of care. You can get back in touch with them and say, here's how I'm planning to tell your story. Here's the context I'm figuring out. Is that right? And journalists tend to feel like they can't or shouldn't do that. And we've had different folks say, well, you know, that's actually unethical for me to do. And it's like, well, according to whose ethics? Like, you can maybe rethink those ethics in this context.
Yeah, it sucks when they translate it to their version instead of what it's really supposed to be. Yeah.
Absolutely. And people really feel like props in someone else's story, I think, a lot of the time. It feels like a sort of paint by numbers story. Okay, here's the story we're going to tell about the Downtown East Side. It's a terrible neighborhood, it has all these problems, and it deserves to be condoified. Okay, let's get, you know, local condo owner in slot number 1, local uppity business owner in slot number 2, down and out community member in slot number 3. Where can we find that person?
And they really hate it when we change the colors that they were wanted to paint it.
Yeah, so that, I think that's sort of what I was connecting to before, Simona, is that you've had, maybe it's Nick who tells a really specific story about that, where he says, you know, it was clear this person was looking for some kind of a, you know, not very intelligent person from the neighborhood to talk to get some kind of like, you know, discreditable quote that they could use to prove their point that these are bad people or something. And he said it sounded like the answers he was giving were a bit too intelligent and eloquent for the reporter's liking.
Oh.
Yep. Then they're all like, take a step back. It's like, how come you're answering it so like, you're supposed to be just a dumb drug addict, right?
Yeah. Get back in your box.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems to me like this might actually be a place where these, you know, as equitable as we can craft them to be partnerships, could really benefit everybody. Because I was thinking about the example that you showed of the article that was just data-based, because a ton of us on this call saw that and were like, I have done that study, you know, like maybe not about that specific population or that specific group, but like, but we've all just been like, hey, I just came across this big spreadsheet. Let's see what's in it and let's write it up, right? And we too, in a way, in a very, very different way, in a way that affects us differently, but also live in like fear of the media because we're not media trained. That's not part of graduate school. We have constant foot and mouth syndrome. And so it seems like pooling the knowledge and the networks of the research community, of the local community, of organizations, of people being represented, and then centering the priorities of people being represented could help us create some solutions. Like, how great would it be for all of us to be able to cultivate a relationship with like one or two reporters who get the scoop, right? Be like, if you know, like, we'll scratch your back if you scratch ours. We'll give you the scoop of this fabulous study if you promise to like be a reasonable human being and present all these human beings like they're human. Yeah. Very cool.
That sounds great.
That sounds like a fancy land.
Well, maybe. But it does speak to some of the, you know, the work that we've thought about and considered around, you know, how are the ways of building these connections into more sustainable, you know, just pathways between people who live in the neighborhood, people who are doing research in the neighborhood, people who are telling media-based stories about the neighborhood. And I think there are a few examples of trusted reporters in the neighborhood that do a really excellent job because they've done the work to build those relationships. Yeah, I mean, one of the things Nick would probably share if he was on the call is we've had this idea of a community research ethics workshop, but alongside it, there's been some discussion of, is there some kind of like a media bureau we could think about in the neighborhood that's like, hey, media is constantly telling the story of this neighborhood. Is there a way we can like kind of funnel that into a more like reliable source of knowledge? Or yeah.
Yeah, so one last question that popped up is really interesting, and I'm going to do my best to interpret this, and if I am misinterpreting it, please pop back into the chat. But the question is, would ethics consideration change if the project was classified by funders as a program evaluation rather than research? And so the way I take that question is that with the IRBs I've worked with and a bunch of other funders, the research we do can kind of be put into two different categories. And one is like, I, the researcher, am taking responsibility for XYZ program. I'm doing a trial. I'm giving multivitamins to half of the group and orange juice to the other half of the group. And therefore I have to get full ethical approval that I am responsibly distributing Flintstones chewables and orange juice to the group, right? Or the other way is that if there is some community group who is already doing, you know, a like syringe and orange juice access program, right? And they're to go ahead and, so I can adopt this sort of documentarian in the wild sort of position where I'm like, I don't have to prove that what you're doing is ethical. I just have to prove that I'm being ethical while I watch you do it. Right. And so, and I guess an initial question is like, and I recognize that as a massive distinction on my end. That distinction is massive on my end because that fundamentally changes the amount of paperwork I have to do by an order of magnitude. But does that distinction make any difference to y'all? Like, is that something where you're like, oh, I've had that problem? Or is this like the first this distinction has sort of like been presented to you in that way? Does it feel the same?
Yeah, it doesn't ring any major bells for me. I don't have experience with program evaluation myself. I know a few folks who do, and I think I can somewhat grasp the difference of from an institutional or research-based perspective on what would the different ethical questions be. Does that connect with anything you're thinking of? I'm just sorry, I'm just asking Simona and Jewel.
Yeah, so like if I'm coming in, for example, to do a study of insight, and I don't run insight, I'm not in charge of it, I don't have anything to do with it, some other responsible person is doing it, what do I, like, how do you expect me to act if I'm not in charge of what's going on? If I'm only in charge of myself, I guess. And how can I be a responsible person while doing that? Because that's sort of what a program evaluation is walking into a conversation or a program that's already happening and then taking notes as to what's going on in the room.
Yeah, I mean, my guess, I'm not going to speak for Jewel and Simona, but I feel like research is research from that perspective. Like, it all feels the same. If you want to work with me, are you going to respect me? If you want to tell the story of my community, are you going to involve us? Whether that's this thing we thought up ourselves or this thing someone else thought up, and we're going to like work with them and check out how that thing is going. Hopefully, the other thing that's going has also been developed in partnership with the community. But if it hasn't, if that thing is already really problematic within the community and now you're the one evaluating it, it's going to be hard to avoid that conflict and tension in the community just because you're trying your best. And these things are all very political, and I think, it just kind of reminded me. You mentioned Insight, but there was an organization in the Downtown East Side called the Drug Users Resource Center that closed a number of years ago, and it closed in part as a result of a kind of evaluation that had been done by the local health authority. And something that Jim, who's one of the folks that couldn't be on the call today, that I remember him telling me is that, it was evaluated, but they were measuring all the wrong things. They found it didn't create these kinds of changes and these variables that mattered to them. And it meant totally different things to our community. And it was absolutely delivering on those variables, I guess. He didn't think of it like that. But, so he was just saying, when you're evaluating something, you've got to have a sense of what your priorities are as a funder, but also what are the tangible positive outcomes for the community.
Or negative.
Or negative outcomes, yeah.
Yeah, because when we closed Dirk, that's what we called it down here, Dirk. Drug Users Resource Center. It was like harsh. Like there was meal program there was showers there. They paid people to do work, and they closed it down. And then it was like there was so many people not doing anything now. It was like they almost made more people feel less than, which was really dumb.
Yeah. So just to say, program evaluation is by no means neutral. If you're doing program evaluation. And I think what it really speaks to is the importance of involving folks who have a better sense of things from the get-go within the community, that you can ask.
No one. Of us, we would have said, no, don't close it.
Or here's the important thing you should ask when you're evaluating this program.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that connects to one of the last questions that was posted, which is, I kind of flipped this question a little bit. The question is, should research be turned down if it doesn't have a person on leadership on the project that has lived experience? And I think what I might ask in response is like, let's imagine that you're a researcher that doesn't have lived experience, right? Where do you start? Like how do you start building relationships, and like, how do I know that I've done enough?
What did you say, Simona?
I said you don't, because you don't really know what's, it's like going to the store and you want apples and you walk out with oranges. You're not going to get the same result, right? So.
Yeah.
What were you going to say, Jewel?
It's on that.
I was going to say that, similar thing. Like, you sort of have to go in with preconceived ideas or certain things in their mind, and rather than actually what is, or to get the facts from the actual source. That could be like a huge hindrance if you don't know the facts, or you're not willing to look into it to get the facts or some of the facts before actually going in, or at least make an effort. Then to me that shows a lot. If they're not willing to at least make an effort or try to sort of ahead of time get some information, or sort of try to get to know even the neighborhood or some of the people or whatever, then that's kind of going to make it very difficult.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I would say, the vast majority of projects don't have someone with that lived experience in leadership necessarily. Hopefully they're at least clearly in a position of like meaningful collaboration in the early stages of the research? I think that would be a good question to ask. And I don't think it's impossible to do good work if someone like me doesn't have lived experience in the things that I'm working on. I think key things are acknowledging that as a limitation that you have, as a blind spot that you have, and recognizing a key part of the first part of your work needs to be bringing yourself into meaningful relationships over time to hopefully at least have people who can call you on your shit, essentially, who can, as Jewel and Simona and all of my other folks regularly do. And I'm really grateful for that, and recognizing like that is like something you need to actively seek out as a person without lived experience, like myself. Not that I haven't lived some experiences, but not the ones that are relevant in this context. So I think, just recognizing that that is always a limitation that you have, that is always a source of blindness that you have, that is a major liability that you have to potentially like really screw up and hurt people, and to try to do everything you can to be super open and receptive to feedback and seeking out, looking for people who will call you on your crap and like tell you when you are doing a bad job and you are messing it up. And hopefully graciously, but even if not, like that's priority number one, I think.
Yeah, you have to remember you're not the experts in that field, right?
Yeah. I'd also
go ahead.
No, I was just remembering this recent crew review that we did of an ethics application. We had this big question. I think you and Jewel were said, okay, so they're saying in their application here that they've got such and such person who has lived experience. And that is sort of like the catch-all phrase that means they're like a great person who has no like ethical problems or something. And I was impressed, like you guys were really critical of that. You said, well, like what lived experience? Is it relevant enough to the thing you're trying to work on? It was a project about incarceration experiences. And it's like, okay, but like, is your person with lived experience, your token person you're gonna get to do these interviews, did they like spend a night in the drunk tank, or have they been inside for like 3 months to a year? Like they're very different lived experiences. So hopefully it's relevant lived experience. And also something we acknowledged in the manifesto was like, what's your lived experience of this topic and how has that shaped your perspective? Because maybe some white dude from the suburbs was an opiate addict for a number of years, and that gave him a very specific perspective on the subject that it may not be one we want to entertain as people with very different lived experiences of opiate use. So it's not as simple as, does someone have lived experience?
Like, did the doctor give you your opiates, or did you buy them in Hastings?
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I do want to recognize that it is now 5:01, so we do need to wrap up, but I want to offer another very, very heartfelt thanks to everyone who's joined us on the call as speakers. Briefly, if someone has interest in talking to anyone at Vandu or anyone who worked on the manifesto about setting up a crew or learning from the lessons you've learned, and hopefully budgeting for that consultation and paying you for your time and expertise in the meantime, who should they get in contact with?
I think my email and Simona's email are on the slide there.
Fabulous.
I can get you connected to other folks as well. There's our community partner, Hives for Humanity. But those would be a good place to start, depending on what you're looking
for. You put my number on too, Scott.
Okay, maybe I'll...
It's not really good for me, right?
Yeah. And this is fabulous. Thank you. I mean, one thing that I've been thinking about while listening to this is I did my very, very first research project ever back in 2007, and I was in Ukraine. I was in like a tiny little town in southern Ukraine, and my first day in this little syringe exchange, they started reading this document, and my Russian was so, and I was like, this sounds familiar. Can I see it? And it was the Vandu Drug Users' Rights Manifesto. So the work that you guys do is, really, really impactful. I mean, we try to give credence to it and to ourselves by doing research. And it's like, look, these ideas that completely smart people who have lived experience and know what they're doing works well. But y'all have all the ideas. So credit where credit is due. Thank you for spending this time with us. And I'm so, so grateful.
Well, thank you so much for having us.